The story of Dr. Alton Greene is not simply a tale of one man's cruelty. It is a reminder of the thin and dangerous line that exists between healer and tormentor, between science and savagery. Greene lived in an age when medicine was still groping in the dark, when doctors wielded absolute power behind closed doors and the voices of the vulnerable were silenced. He believed he was curing insanity, but in truth, he was feeding his own obsession with control, carving suffering into the lives of those entrusted to his care. His patients were not experiments. They were human beings, forgotten by families and abandoned by a society that preferred silence to truth. What makes his story most chilling is that Greene was not entirely unique. His asylum was one of many across America where cruelty hid beneath the mask of progress. Yet Greene's arrogance, his belief in the righteousness of pain, and his willingness to push further than others cemented his legacy as one of the most disturbing figures in American medical history. His downfall came not from the countless forgotten poor, but from the single case of a child whose death could not be ignored, a tragedy that finally forced society to confront the nightmare within its own institutions. Today, the ruins of his asylum stand as more than crumbling stone. They are a monument to human suffering, a place where the past whispers warnings to the present. They remind us that progress without compassion becomes tyranny, and that the search for knowledge without empathy descends into madness. Dr. Alton Greene may have vanished into history, but the lesson he left behind is eternal. When doctors forget their duty to heal, they risk becoming the very monsters they claim to fight. And in that truth lies the darkest irony of all, that perhaps, in the end, the most disturbed soul within Greene's asylum was the doctor himself. Today, the ruins of Greene's asylum still stand, swallowed by weeds and time. The stone walls crumble, the windows gape like hollow eyes, and the corridors echo only with wind. Yet for many, the silence carries weight, as though the screams of the past are still imprinted in the air. Tourists wander through with cameras, hoping to capture a glimpse of the supernatural. Historians sift through fragile records, piecing together fragments of truth from layers of cover-up. And locals, even now, speak Greene's name with unease, lowering their voices as though he might still be listening. Dr. Alton Greene's life ended in mystery. Some claimed he fled to Europe, others that he perished in obscurity, perhaps even within the asylum's walls. But his shadow remains, not only in Pennsylvania, but in the way we remember the past. His story asks an unsettling question. Was he a monster born of his own cruelty, or a reflection of a society willing to sacrifice its most vulnerable for the illusion of progress? The answer may never be clear. What is certain is this: Greene's asylum was not just a building. It was a wound carved into history, a place where medicine turned to madness, and where the line between healer and tormentor was lost forever. Historians later studied the case of Dr. Alton Greene not only as a story of horror, but as a mirror of the time. He was not, after all, the only doctor to practice cruelty under the guise of treatment. Across America and Europe, asylums were filled with experiments that today would be unthinkable. Patients were shackled, bled, drowned, cut, and left in silence. Greene stood out not because he was alone, but because he carried these methods to their extremes and cloaked them in arrogance. His name became a shorthand for the dangers of unchecked authority, a reminder of what happens when ambition eclipses empathy. The asylum movement itself, once hailed as a revolution, eventually collapsed under its own weight. By the early 20th century, reports of abuse across the nation forced reforms. Yet the scars remained. Thousands of lives had been destroyed in the pursuit of curing madness. Greene's legacy became part of that larger cautionary tale, a symbol of how easily society can mistake cruelty for progress when desperate for answers. His story endures not only as legend, but as a dark chapter in the history of psychiatry. Stories of hauntings soon clung to the asylum like a shroud. Visitors claimed to hear the faint sound of weeping drifting from empty wards. Others reported the echo of footsteps following them through crumbling corridors, only to turn and find no one there. Paranormal investigators who braved the ruins spoke of sudden drops in temperature, shadows that darted across walls, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched. The most chilling tales came from those who ventured into the basements, where the air was thick and stale. Many described the sound of water dripping, though no pipes remained, and the faint scent of chemicals that lingered even decades later. Locals said the spirits of Greene's patients had never found peace. The children, especially, were believed to haunt the grounds. Some swore they saw small figures at the windows, or heard the patter of tiny feet on staircases that had collapsed long ago. To skeptics, these were just stories told to frighten tourists. But to those who lived nearby, the asylum was alive in its own way, alive with echoes of suffering that could not be erased. Whether ghosts or memory, the presence of Greene's victims endured, reminding everyone of what had been done in the name of science. After Greene's downfall, the asylum in Pennsylvania became a place of shadows. Though some wards continued under new leadership, the building itself never shook its reputation. Families no longer trusted its halls, and admissions dropped sharply. Parts of the asylum were abandoned, their doors locked and their corridors left to rot. Windows shattered, ivy crept up the stone walls, and whispers grew louder that the place was cursed. Local children dared each other to approach its gates at night, swearing they heard cries echoing from within. Farmers claimed that lantern lights still flickered in the basements, though the wings had long been sealed. The land itself seemed stained by what had happened there. Townsfolk avoided it, saying the soil was heavy with the bones of Greene's victims. Some swore that crops near the asylum failed to grow, while animals refused to graze close to its walls. Whether superstition or truth, the asylum became a scar on the community, an abandoned shell filled with memories too painful to face. And yet, despite the silence that settled over its halls, the legacy of Dr. Alton Greene did not fade. His name became a warning, a reminder of how power and ambition can twist medicine into monstrosity. Under mounting pressure, state authorities launched an inquiry into Greene's asylum. Inspectors arrived unannounced, breaking the doctor's carefully rehearsed performances. What they found could not be hidden. Patients locked in filth, their bodies marked with scars and bruises. Secret wards where men and women wasted away in darkness. Surgical instruments stained with blood, poorly concealed in basements. Records altered, names missing, deaths unreported. The findings shocked even hardened officials. Greene, once celebrated as a visionary, was suddenly branded a monster. His medical license was revoked. The asylum's most brutal wards were shut down, and families demanded the return of their loved ones, though many were too broken to leave. Greene himself faced charges of malpractice and abuse, but powerful allies shielded him from prison. Instead, he vanished. Some said he fled west, continuing his experiments in secret. Others whispered he had gone mad, trapped in the very delusions he once sought to cure. And in Pennsylvania, the asylum remained, a scar upon the land, its walls heavy with the suffering he had caused. Dr. Alton Greene's reign was over, but the legend of his cruelty was only beginning. The breaking point came when the asylum received a new patient, the young daughter of a prominent Pennsylvania family. Only 12 years old, she had been committed for uncontrollable seizures. Her parents, desperate for answers, entrusted her to Greene, believing his reputation as a pioneer. Within weeks, she disappeared into the basement wards. When her parents visited, Greene assured them she was improving, though he refused to let them see her. Their suspicions grew, and after weeks of pressure, Greene reluctantly revealed the truth. the girl had died under treatment. He offered no details, only a curt explanation that her body had been buried swiftly for hygienic reasons. The family was outraged. Unlike the poor or voiceless patients who had vanished before, this child belonged to people of influence. They demanded an investigation, and this time, officials could not look away. Newspapers seized on the story, painting the asylum not as a place of healing but as a chamber of horror. Greene tried to defend himself, speaking of bravery and progress, but the tide was turning. For the first time, the public began to see through the facade. The death of one child succeeded where hundreds of vanished paupers had failed. It made Dr. Greene a villain in the eyes of society. In 1877, Greene announced that he was on the verge of a breakthrough. He claimed to have developed a treatment that could permanently reset the insane mind. In private, staff whispered that his so-called cure involved a combination of isolation, hydrotherapy, and surgical mutilation, pushing patients beyond the brink of survival. Greene, however, insisted it was revolutionary. He selected a group of patients as subjects: a war veteran haunted by visions, a young mother suffering grief, a boy afflicted with seizures. They were taken to the hidden lower wards, and for weeks, no one saw them again. When Greene finally unveiled his results, he presented a handful of patients who appeared calm, silent, and obedient. He paraded them before visitors as proof of his genius. But those who looked closer saw the truth. Their eyes were vacant, their movements stiff, their personalities erased. They were not cured, they were broken. Whispers spread that these were not recoveries but living corpses, minds shattered beyond repair. Still, Greene boasted to newspapers of his success, and supporters clung to the illusion. Yet for the staff who knew what had been done, the promised cure was nothing more than cruelty perfected. By 1876, the asylum's records began to show troubling gaps. Patients who had been committed only months before suddenly vanished from the books, their names erased as if they had never existed. Families who inquired were told vague stories. Their loved one had been transferred, or had escaped, or had succumbed to sudden illness. Yet no paperwork followed, and no graves could be found. The townsfolk whispered that the earth behind the asylum was hiding secrets, that fresh soil was turned at night, and lanterns bobbed along the edge of the woods where no workers should have been. Nurses reported entire wards being cleared out under Greene's orders, with patients never seen again. Those who remained spoke of the missing in hushed tones, their voices trembling. One patient swore he heard the cries of his friends echoing from the basement long after they had disappeared. Another described the stench of burning flesh rising through the vents, only to be silenced with restraints. Greene brushed these accounts aside, claiming that madness often fed delusions, but the rumors refused to die. Each vanished patient deepened the fear within the asylum, and in the town, suspicions turned into dread. Something monstrous was happening inside those walls, and it was only a matter of time before it surfaced. Eventually, even Greene's carefully maintained image began to crack. Rumors circulated in medical circles about patients disappearing from records. Rival doctors whispered that his methods were too extreme, his obsession with pain bordering on sadism. Journalists who once praised him started asking sharper questions. Most damning of all were the families, mothers, fathers, and siblings, who demanded answers about missing relatives. One grieving father stormed the asylum's gates, claiming he had evidence that his son had been experimented upon. Greene dismissed him as delusional, but the story spread across Pennsylvania. Behind closed doors, Greene grew more paranoid. He tightened his control over staff, threatening those who spoke out. He forbade attendants from leaving the grounds without permission, turning the asylum into a fortress of secrecy. The more suspicion grew, the more he doubled down on his experiments, desperate to prove his theories before exposure destroyed him. What he did not realize was that the very methods he championed, the darkness, the pain, the silence, were building a case against him. And soon, it would only take one tragedy, one undeniable death, to shatter the illusion he had so carefully constructed. Still, silence came at a cost. Deaths inside the asylum mounted, too frequent to ignore. Local graveyards began to fill with unnamed bodies, buried quickly and without ceremony. Records listed causes like exhaustion or sudden decline, vague phrases that disguised the truth. Families who pressed for answers received polite letters filled with medical jargon but no clarity. Some never received letters at all. Instead, they were told their loved one had wandered off or succumbed to a fit. These evasions stirred suspicion, but Greene's authority made it difficult to challenge him. Meanwhile, the asylum's surviving patients grew increasingly unstable. Instead of improving, many deteriorated, reduced to hollow shells of who they once were. Former soldiers who entered with nightmares left unable to speak. Women committed for grief emerged catatonic, their eyes vacant. Children lost the ability to walk or feed themselves. Nurses who cared enough to speak out described a place of despair, where hope was deliberately crushed. Yet, without evidence strong enough to outweigh Greene's reputation, their pleas fell on deaf ears. Society, it seemed, was more comfortable believing in progress than confronting horror. Not everyone doubted Greene. Among the wealthy elite and political class, he still had allies who saw him as a visionary. They attended his lectures, where he spoke with eloquence about unlocking the brain and confronting the roots of madness. He displayed carefully chosen patients, those who appeared calmer after weeks of harsh treatment, and claimed these as his successes. The audience applauded, eager to believe that insanity could be tamed. For them, Greene's asylum was not a house of torment but a beacon of scientific progress. These supporters had power. Local newspapers, funded by politicians who backed Greene, printed glowing accounts of his work. When whispers of abuse surfaced, they were brushed aside as the rantings of disgruntled staff or hysterical relatives. Government inspections, when they occurred, were announced in advance, giving Greene time to stage immaculate wards and present cooperative patients. The darker wings were locked away, the most broken patients hidden. Inspectors saw only what Greene wanted them to see, and their reports declared the asylum a model of modern care. This alliance between power and cruelty ensured Greene's survival far longer than his patients ever could. By the mid-1870s, the asylum in Pennsylvania no longer seemed like a sanctuary but a looming threat. Villagers who lived nearby spoke of eerie sounds drifting through the night, the faint wailing of women, the guttural cries of men, and sometimes what they swore were children screaming. Farmers passing the grounds at dusk saw figures pacing behind barred windows, their silhouettes jerking unnaturally in the flicker of lamplight. Though families continued to send their loved ones to Greene, unease spread through the countryside. Taverns filled with hushed conversations about the doctor's cruelty. Church sermons warned of false healers who sought glory instead of mercy. And yet nothing was ever proven. Greene's charisma shielded him, and his polished reputation made ordinary people doubt their own fears. Inside, staff began to break. Young attendants quit after only weeks, shaken by the violence they witnessed. Some left notes behind, describing patients whipped until they bled, others confined in boxes so small they could not stand. But most of these testimonies were silenced, either destroyed by Greene or dismissed by officials who feared scandal. Only the patients knew the full horror, and their voices carried no weight. To the outside world, their cries were nothing more than the raving of the insane. And so the asylum continued to operate, its secrets buried in silence. Greene's ambition did not stop at restraint or deprivation. Obsessed with the idea of physically altering the brain, He began crude surgical experiments long before neurology had the tools to support such work. Using unsterilized instruments, he drilled into skulls, attempting to release pressure that he believed caused delusions. Patients strapped to tables screamed as the scalpel cut into their flesh, often without anesthetic. Those who survived were left with permanent scars, seizures, or worse. Personalities erased, memories shattered. Greene documented these outcomes with chilling detachment, describing them as necessary sacrifices for the greater understanding of insanity. What horrified many nurses was not only the brutality but the randomness of his choices. Greene selected patients at will, a veteran suffering nightmares, a child prone to fits, a woman grieving the loss of her husband. None were safe from his scalpel. When patients died, he dismissed it as unavoidable, a small price for discovery. Rumors spread of hidden burial grounds behind the asylum, where unmarked graves swallowed the evidence. Yet Greene's confidence never faltered. In his mind, he was a pioneer, a man willing to go where others lacked the courage. To his patients, he was a butcher cloaked in the language of science. Beyond physical pain, Greene was fascinated with the effects of sensory deprivation. He believed that madness grew stronger through stimulation, and therefore, isolation could purge it. Patients were sealed into rooms with no windows, no sound, no contact for weeks at a time. The only light came when guards opened the door to deliver food. Small rations of bread and water slid across the floor. Some patients scratched the walls until their nails broke. Others curled into corners, rocking themselves to sleep in the endless dark. Greene recorded their decline as evidence. Hallucinations, broken speech, and eventual silence. To him, silence meant progress. But silence was not healing, it was surrender. The human mind, stripped of connection, withered in those rooms. When patients were finally released, they stumbled like phantoms, their eyes unable to bear the light, their voices reduced to whispers. Some never recovered at all. The staff called these rooms the tombs, and even hardened attendants refused to linger near them. Yet Greene insisted that deprivation was the key to reprogramming the mind. The outside world never saw the tombs. Families were shown only tidy wards, never the hidden wings where men and women slowly unraveled in eternal darkness. One of Greene's most infamous practices was his obsession with hydrotherapy, a treatment already in use at the time but twisted into something far more brutal under his hand. Where other doctors used warm baths to calm restless patients, Greene preferred ice. He believed that plunging a body into freezing water shocked the mind, wiping away delusions through physical terror. Patients were submerged in barrels of icy liquid until their lips turned blue, their bodies shaking violently. Some were left there for minutes, others for hours. Nurses who protested were told they lacked scientific vision. When patients fainted, Greene called it a sign of progress. When they convulsed, he declared their madness was leaving the body. Records whispered of men who drowned in these baths, women whose hearts failed under the cold, and children who emerged shivering, too weak to cry. But Greene documented these tragedies as failures of constitution, never admissions of cruelty. He spoke at conferences about his frozen cure, masking the horror with clinical language. Yet those who lived through it never forgot. Survivors later recalled the terror of being dragged toward the barrels, the smell of the icy water, the moment their lungs filled with panic. For them, it was not treatment. It was torture dressed in the cloak of medicine. Dr. Alton Greene believed something few dared to say aloud, that madness could be disciplined out of the body. To him, insanity was not a sickness of the soul but a weakness of will, and weakness had only one cure: pain. He preached that suffering could strip away delusions, that fear could bend a fractured mind back into obedience. It was a philosophy that appealed to those who saw patients as burdens rather than people. For Greene, Every scream was evidence of progress, every broken spirit a sign of success. His doctrine was simple. If a patient did not improve, it was not because the treatment had failed, but because the patient had resisted. Within his asylum, this ideology turned into practice. Patients were routinely whipped with leather straps for disobedience. Greene insisted it was not punishment but moral correction, a method to remind the insane of consequence. He introduced starvation diets for those who refused to cooperate, forcing them to work for scraps of bread. Water was withheld until patients obeyed his commands. To the outside world, he framed these as tests of willpower, but to those inside, they were calculated tortures. Greene blurred the line between doctor and jailer, scientist and sadist, until no difference remained. To step into Dr. Greene's asylum was to enter a world that looked, at first glance, orderly and modern. Families saw polished corridors, neat wards, and quiet attendants who bowed respectfully. Greene himself would guide them through certain wings, showing patients reading calmly or working in small gardens. But these were staged illusions carefully maintained for outsiders. Deeper inside, beyond the locked doors, reality shifted into something far darker. Patients were divided not only by condition but by Greene's own judgment of their usefulness. Some were confined in tiny cells, where straw replaced bedding and light never entered. Others were strapped into chairs for hours, forced to sit in silence while Greene lectured about discipline. He spoke of retraining the mind, but his methods resembled punishment more than therapy. The asylum, in truth, was not a hospital. It was a prison, and Greene its warden. Those who resisted were restrained, those who cried were silenced, and those who begged for freedom were forgotten. In Pennsylvania, whispers began to spread. The asylum cured no one, and Dr. Greene's wards were filled with more corpses than recoveries. Yet still, families kept sending their loved ones, clinging to the desperate hope that science could save them. Dr. Alton Greene entered this landscape with impeccable timing. Trained in medicine, eloquent in speech, and ambitious in spirit, he embodied the image of a modern physician. When he spoke at medical gatherings, his words carried confidence. Insanity, he claimed, was not a mystery but a puzzle that science could solve. Families were desperate to believe him. Newspapers praised his vision of a society freed from madness. To reformers, he was a rising star. To politicians, a man who could justify the growing asylum system. Greene's charisma masked his darker impulses, and his ability to inspire trust gave him something even more powerful than credentials: access. Parents brought their children to him. Wives were surrendered by husbands. Veterans were delivered in chains. Greene never refused a case. He promised healing, spoke of scientific breakthroughs, and carried himself with an air of destiny. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, something more sinister brewed. He was not content with simple care. He believed that true healing required force, that sanity could be broken out of a mind through suffering. Patients soon discovered that Greene's gentle words in public transformed into cold commands in private. And once inside his asylum, there was no escape. By the mid-19th century, America was in the grip of what historians later called the asylum movement. Reformers and philanthropists claimed that building vast hospitals for the mentally ill would solve one of society's darkest problems. Across the country, enormous stone institutions rose, their Gothic towers looming over quiet towns. Pennsylvania was no exception. These asylums were designed according to the Kirkbride Plan, a style of architecture that embodied both grandeur and isolation. Long wings stretched outward, separating patients by category: the violent, the melancholic, the epileptic, the incurable. To the public, these buildings were monuments of compassion. Visitors saw clean gardens, orderly wards, and solemn doctors in crisp coats. But behind the facade, the truth was far less noble. understaffed, overcrowded, and under constant pressure to produce results. Many asylums became warehouses of human suffering. Patients languished in filth, strapped to beds, forgotten by families. And within these walls, doctors held absolute power. Whatever they declared as treatment was law, and no patient could refuse. It was in this world of unchecked authority that Dr. Greene rose, perfectly positioned to exploit a system built on silence. The America of 1871 was a nation scarred. The Civil War had ended just a few years earlier, yet its wounds bled into every household. Across Pennsylvania and beyond, men wandered aimlessly through streets, their eyes hollow, their speech disjointed, their memories fractured by the horrors of battle. Families did not know what to call it, but they saw the torment. Sleepless nights, violent fits, sudden outbursts of tears. To society, these were not war heroes struggling with invisible scars. They were lunatics, and so they were sent away, locked in institutions that promised to restore them. But soldiers were not the only ones. Women who dared to resist domestic life, who fell into depression after childbirth, or who suffered seizures were labeled hysterics. Children who could not speak properly, who struggled in school, or who suffered epileptic fits were branded defective. Once marked, their fates were often sealed. Asylums became the convenient solution, places to hide away the unwanted, the inconvenient, the misunderstood. For the public, they represented progress. For families, they offered relief from shame. And for ambitious men like Dr. Alton Greene, they provided an endless supply of subjects to mold, to test, to control. By the mid-1870s, the name of Dr. Alton Greene had already begun to curdle in the public imagination. Newspapers that once praised his brilliance grew cautious, publishing anonymous letters from former staff who accused him of cruelty. Local villagers told tales of lost family members, of husbands, wives, and children who had entered the asylum but never emerged. The asylum, once meant to be a symbol of progress, became known instead as a haunted place, where science had twisted into something monstrous. Greene, however, denied everything. To his supporters, he was still a misunderstood pioneer, a man too daring for his time. To his critics, he was a sadist hiding behind the mask of medicine. But for those who lived and died under his care, he was nothing less than a nightmare in human form. What makes Greene's story so disturbing is not only the brutality of his methods, but the chilling reminder that he was not alone. Across America and Europe, asylums were filled with doctors who blurred the line between healing and harm, who believed that suffering was a path to sanity. Greene's name has survived not because he was unique, but because he was perhaps the most extreme. A man who embraced cruelty as treatment and left behind scars that would echo for generations. Today, the ruins of asylums like his still stand, their windows broken, their walls covered in ivy, their halls said to be haunted by the cries of those who never escaped. And if you listen closely, in the empty silence of those crumbling corridors, you might still hear the faint echo of Dr. Alton Greene, America's most disturbing asylum doctor. Dr. Alton Greene was born to a wealthy family, educated in the best medical schools of the East Coast, and quickly earned a reputation for his charisma and intensity. Unlike other doctors who spoke cautiously about mental illness, Greene made bold declarations. That insanity was not a mystery but a disease he alone could treat. His confidence won him patrons, and soon he was appointed director of a new asylum in Pennsylvania. The building itself became his laboratory. From the outside, it was a towering structure of stone and iron, with long wings stretching like arms across the land. But inside, it was a maze of locked wards, padded rooms, and shadowy basements. Nurses worked in fear, patients trembled at the sound of his footsteps, and every experiment he conducted tightened his grip on the institution. Greene claimed he wanted to strip away the delusions of the insane, to bring them back into the light of rational thought. But the methods he used revealed another side of him, a fascination with control, suffering, and obedience. He believed that madness could be beaten out, drowned out, starved out, or burned away. Families entrusted him with their loved ones, believing his promises, but many of those patients never returned home. Their names disappeared from records, their bodies buried without ceremony in unmarked graves. And as the years passed, whispers spread among townsfolk, of screams that carried into the night, of figures glimpsed at barred windows, of strange smells rising from the asylum's basement. In Pennsylvania, the asylum was no longer a place of hope. It was a place of fear, and Greene its ghostly master. The late 19th century was obsessed with madness. The Civil War had left behind broken men, haunted by invisible wounds. Veterans stumbled through streets, raving, shaking, and unable to rejoin ordinary life. Women who suffered from postpartum depression or grief were locked away, labeled hysterics. Children with epilepsy, speech disorders, or developmental challenges were hidden from sight and institutionalized, often for life. In those days, a diagnosis of insanity could mean almost anything, and once branded, there was little chance of escape. Asylums promised hope, but too often they became warehouses of despair. To the outside world, Pennsylvania's asylum under Dr. Greene looked like a marvel of modern medicine. Its halls were lit with new gas lamps, its architecture inspired awe with tall spires and long wings, and its doors opened to desperate families who believed they were delivering their loved ones into care. Greene himself presented as a visionary, a man with sharp eyes, a commanding voice, and the authority of science behind him. He lectured about the brain being a machine that could be reset through discipline, shock, and rigorous intervention. But the reality behind those proud speeches was something nightmarish. Patients soon discovered that Greene's definition of treatment was punishment, that his belief in discipline was closer to sadism. He spoke of curing insanity, but what he pursued was control, domination, and ultimately the breaking of human spirit. And once someone entered his asylum, their fate rested entirely in his hands. The year was 1871. In the quiet, mist-draped hills of Pennsylvania, where farmland stretched into shadowy forests and iron rails cut across the countryside, a new kind of institution was rising, the American asylum. To the public, these massive Gothic buildings were symbols of progress and compassion, places where the broken minds of society could be mended. But for those who passed through their barred gates, the truth was far darker. Behind the stone walls, screams echoed through the night, muffled by thick doors and long corridors, while families outside whispered about the horrors within. It was a time when mental illness was still barely understood, when madness was a word that covered everything from grief to epilepsy, from postpartum depression to shell shock. Into this confusing and fearful world emerged a man whose name would soon become synonymous with terror, Dr. Alton Greene. He was not the kind of doctor who offered comfort, nor the kind of reformer who fought for humane treatment. Greene was different. He came to Pennsylvania with lofty ambitions, speaking in grand lectures about curing insanity and restoring the human soul. The newspapers of the time praised his intellect and boldness, calling him one of the country's most promising voices in psychiatry. But in the shadowed wards of his asylum, the patients knew another man, a man whose experiments blurred the line between science and cruelty, whose methods belonged less to healing and more to torture. For them, Dr. Greene was no savior. He was a warden, a tormentor, and perhaps even something worse. This is the story of America's most disturbing asylum doctor, and how his name became a whispered warning for generations.